She cried out on the trail, her hands pressed to her belly, the child within still weeks from birth. Hunger had already carved her face hollow, her voice raw with desperation. The mountain man heard, and what he chose that night would change both their lives forever. The wind carried her voice like a broken hymn across the dark timberline. "Please, my baby and I will be starving out here." Clara Martin's cry was thin, yet it cut through the silence of the pines. She stumbled forward, skirts torn, her shawl a threadbare scrap that barely clung to her shoulders. One hand clutched the swell of her belly, the other braced against the rough bark of a spruce as she tried to stay upright. Each step seemed heavier than the last, not from the weight of snow alone but from weeks of hunger, nights without rest, and the crushing fear that both she and her unborn child would never see another dawn. The cabin rose ahead like something carved out of the mountain itself, thick logs blackened by smoke, its chimney sending a thin ribbon skyward. Clara fell to her knees in the snow, breath bursting in shallow clouds. She raised her hand, trembling, and knocked against the door. Once, twice. The sound was so faint she feared it would be swallowed whole by the storm. Inside, Daniel Holt stiffened. He had lived alone in these mountains for nearly 7 years, a man who spoke more with the crack of an axe than with words. His fire burned low, his rifle leaned against the hearth, his nights spent in the company of silence. He had learned long ago that a knock after dark meant trouble. Men came that way, looking for food, shelter, or blood. Still, the sound of that voice, it wasn't a man's call. It was thin, desperate, breaking like it had been carried too far and for too long. Daniel opened the door and the light from his hearth spilled across the snow. Clara collapsed forward, landing hard against his boots. Her face was pale, lips cracked, eyes sunken but burning with fierce determination. "Please," she whispered, her voice raw. "I can't go any farther. My baby." Her hand pressed to her belly again, as if to shield the life within from the cold. For a long second, Daniel didn't move. He looked down at her, this stranger broken by the trail, her belly round with a child yet unborn. His cabin had not known another soul in years. He lived this way by choice, a man carved from solitude, but the sight of her trembling form struck him like a blow. He bent, lifted her gently, though she weighed less than he expected, her body weakened by too many days without food. He carried her inside, the door slamming shut against the wind. The warmth of the cabin enveloped her, but Clara shivered still. Daniel laid her down near the fire, fetched a blanket and wrapped it around her shoulders. She curled toward the flames, whispering her thanks, though her eyes fluttered shut from exhaustion. He knelt, watching her carefully, torn between caution and something deeper, a stirring he hadn't felt since before the mountains claimed him. When Clara woke again, the fire had burned brighter, logs stacked high to chase away the night. A cup of broth sat steaming beside her, and Daniel Holt was seated across the room, his face shadowed by the lamplight. His broad frame leaned forward, his hands clasped loosely, as if ready for answers. Clara tried to push herself upright, but weakness pinned her down. Still, she met his eyes. "I'm Clara Martin," she whispered, her voice rasping. "My husband, he left us. Said he'd fetch supplies from the town yonder, but he never came back. Days turned into weeks, and I couldn't wait any longer, not with the baby." Her words broke and tears welled in her eyes, though she wiped them away quickly, as though ashamed to show the depth of her fear. Daniel's jaw tightened. He had seen men like that before, men who made promises with their mouths and broke them with their backs turned. He stirred the fire, the crackle filling the silence between them. Finally, his voice came, low and steady. "You won't last out there alone. Not in your state." Clara swallowed hard, her hand resting protectively over her stomach. "I know, but I had nowhere else to go." The room settled into quiet again, save for the soft hiss of the fire. Daniel studied her, the fragility of her frame, the determination still flickering in her eyes. Against his better judgment, he felt something shift inside him. He had closed his cabin to the world years ago, but the world had come knocking tonight, not in the form of an enemy, but in the form of a woman with a child yet to be born. He pushed the cup of broth closer. "Drink," he said simply. Her hands trembled as she lifted the cup, sipping slowly, the warmth spreading through her hollow body. Her eyes filled again, but this time not just with grief. Gratitude, fragile but true, glimmered there. She lowered the cup, her voice faint. "You've saved us. I don't even know your name." Daniel looked into the flames as though the answer were hidden there. "Holt," he said after a long pause. "Daniel Holt." The name seemed to anchor her, and she repeated it softly, as though it were a lifeline. Daniel. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of another soul in his cabin, and it did not feel unwelcome. But outside, the storm raged on, and deep within Daniel knew this night was only the beginning. For Clara Martin had not just brought herself and her unborn child into his home, she had brought a reckoning he had long thought buried. Morning came with a pale light that filtered through the cracks in the shutters, painting the cabin in gray and gold. Daniel Holt rose first, his body trained by years of routine, and tended to the fire before stepping out into the snow. The air was bitter, sharp enough to sting his lungs, and his boots crunched as he crossed to the woodpile. The axe bit clean through the frozen logs, each strike ringing out like a bell across the empty valley. Solitude had once made these mornings feel endless, but today there was no quiet comfort in the repetition. Today there was someone inside, someone who had arrived with nothing but a child yet unborn and a story cut short by abandonment. Inside, Clara stirred slowly, her body aching but warmer than it had been in days. She blinked against the thin light, the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. For a moment she almost forgot where she was. The fire burned steady, a shelf of books sat in orderly rows, and the sound of wood splitting echoed beyond the walls. It was a home, not hers, but a home nonetheless. She pressed her hand to her stomach, whispering softly, "We're safe, at least for now." The baby shifted faintly within, a reminder that time was moving fast, too fast. Daniel returned, arms stacked with firewood. He set it by the door, then wiped the frost from his beard with a gloved hand. His eyes found Clara still bundled by the hearth, her face thinner than any woman should bear, but her eyes brighter than last night. He moved toward the kettle, poured water into a tin cup, and set it by her side. "Drink," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Clara managed a smile, though her lips cracked at the corners. "You don't waste words, do you?" she asked softly. Daniel didn't answer right away. He stoked the fire, the flames leaping higher. Finally, he said, "Words don't split wood, don't keep a roof standing. Better to use them when they matter." Clara lowered her gaze, nodding slowly. She wasn't a stranger to silence. Matthew, her husband, had used it often, though not in the same way. His had been cold, heavy with disdain, whereas Daniel's silence was steady, like the mountain itself. She sipped from the cup, the water warming her throat, then whispered, "Thank you for taking me in. I didn't know if you'd open the door." Daniel didn't look at her, but his hands slowed their work as he listened. "I almost didn't." That truth hung heavy between them. Clara's breath caught, but she didn't speak. She simply nodded again, understanding more than his words revealed. He had every reason not to open that door. Danger often wore disguises, and trust could be a man's undoing. Yet here she was, and here he had let her stay. The day stretched long. Daniel busied himself with chores, breaking ice from the trough, checking the traps, and mending a fence rail that had cracked under the storm. Clara watched him from the doorway, shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. He moved with precision, each task done with care but never wasted motion. He was a man who had built his life to endure, not to be seen. "Can I help?" she asked at one point, stepping down into the snow. Daniel looked up from the trough, the axe handle resting against his shoulder. "You should be resting." Clara shook her head. "Resting won't feed a child, not mine, not yours." Her words were gentle but firm, and Daniel's jaw tightened at the implication. For a long second he said nothing, then finally nodded toward the stack of split wood. "If you're set on helping, carry some of that inside." Clara's fingers trembled from the cold, but she lifted the logs one by one, carrying them to the hearth. The effort left her winded, but pride flickered in her chest. She would not be useless. She could not afford to be. By midday, Daniel returned from the line of traps, a brace of rabbits slung over his shoulder. Clara's eyes widened at the sight of fresh meat, her stomach tightening with hunger at the smell of fur and snow. Daniel skinned them quickly, his knife sure and clean, and soon the pot above the fire filled the cabin with a savory aroma that made Clara's hands shake as she stirred. When the first bowl was handed to her, she nearly wept from the taste. It was simple, nothing more than meat and water and a pinch of salt, but it was a feast compared to what she had known these past weeks. As she ate, her eyes drifted toward Daniel. "Why do you live out here alone?" she asked cautiously. He didn't answer at first. His knife scraped against the table as he carved a length of wood into something smaller, something purposeful. Finally, he said, "Because there's no one left to live with." Clara froze, her spoon halfway to her lips. She wanted to ask more, but the weight of his voice stopped her. She understood what he had not said. Loss had driven him here, into the mountains, away from the noise of towns and the grasp of men. She bowed her head, whispering softly, "I'm sorry." Daniel didn't look up. "Nothing to be sorry for. We all carry our ghosts. Some of us just live far enough away so no one else can hear them." The fire cracked, filling the silence that followed. Clara clutched her belly, her heart aching not just for herself, but for the man who had saved her. She could not imagine the depth of sorrow that would drive someone into such solitude, but she could feel it in the way he held himself, in the way his words landed like stones. That night, as the snow thickened again outside, Clara lay awake by the fire, listening to the steady rhythm of Daniel's breathing from the far side of the room. She whispered a prayer, her lips moving silently, asking God for strength, for mercy, for a chance to bring her child into the world safely. When she closed her eyes, the baby kicked faintly, and tears slipped down her cheeks. In the dark, Daniel turned slightly, watching her shoulders tremble as she prayed. He said nothing, but his chest tightened. He had not spoken to God in years, not since the earth had swallowed everything he loved. Yet hearing her whispered plea stirred something long buried. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin, two broken souls breathed in the same air, carrying different scars but bound now by a fragile thread of survival. Neither of them knew what the next day would bring, but both understood this. The world beyond the cabin door was merciless, and sooner or later it would come knocking again. The storm eased by morning, leaving a pale blue sky stretched above the pines. Snow clung heavy to the branches, bending them low, and the valley lay quiet except for the sound of the creek pushing through ice. Daniel Holt stepped outside before first light, boots crunching into the hard crust of snow, his breath rising in clouds. The air smelled clean, almost sharp, but beneath that clarity ran a sense of foreboding. He had seen too many winters to be fooled. Storms didn't pass so quickly, without leaving more trouble in their wake. Inside, Clara Martin stirred from uneasy sleep. Her body ached, the weight of her unborn child pressing down on her bones, yet when she opened her eyes to the glow of the hearth she felt a kind of safety she had not known in months. She sat up slowly, fingers smoothing the blanket Daniel had given her, and listened to the quiet hum of the cabin. It wasn't her home. It never could be. But for the first time since Matthew had left, she felt like the ground beneath her wasn't collapsing. She rose carefully and moved to the small window. Outside, Daniel was splitting wood again, his axe rising and falling with steady precision. She watched him for a long while, the rhythm hypnotic, until the baby stirred within her, pulling her thoughts back. She laid a hand on her belly and whispered, "You're safe, little one, at least today." When Daniel returned, his arms stacked with logs, Clara met him at the door. "Let me help," she said softly, reaching for the wood. He hesitated, his eyes narrowing, then handed her 2 pieces. "Don't push yourself," he said, his voice flat but not unkind. Clara carried them to the fire, her steps careful. She set them down with pride, though the effort left her breathless. Daniel noticed. He didn't comment, but he filed it away, the sight of her stubborn determination planting itself firmly in his mind. As the hours passed, the cabin settled into a rhythm that felt almost natural. Daniel tended to the animals, repaired the roof where the storm had torn shingles loose, and checked the line of traps deeper in the woods. Clara swept the cabin floor, washed the tin dishes, and mended one of Daniel's shirts with thread she found tucked away in a drawer. It was small work, but it gave her hands something to do, her heart something steady to cling to. By afternoon, Daniel returned with his traps full, 2 hares and a fox. He skinned them on the porch, his knife clean and efficient, while Clara watched from the doorway. She winced at the sight, though she understood it was survival. When he noticed her expression, he paused, wiping the blade against his trousers. "It's the way of things up here," he said simply. "Eat or be eaten. Best not to think on it too long." Clara nodded, though her stomach twisted. She was grateful, deeply so, but each new reminder of how unforgiving this land could be pressed down harder on her heart. "I know," she murmured. I worry about what's coming." Daniel looked at her then, really looked. "You're close," he said quietly, his eyes flicking to her belly. "Child won't wait much longer." Clara swallowed hard, tears threatening. "I can feel it. Some nights I think, what if I don't make it? What if—" Her voice broke, and she pressed both hands against her stomach, trembling. Daniel set the knife aside and stepped closer. He didn't touch her, he wasn't sure he had the right, but his voice carried a weight that steadied the room. "You will, and that child will too. You've come this far, that counts for more than you think." For a moment, Clara met his gaze, and in his eyes she saw not just solitude but something stronger, conviction forged from loss, a will that had not been broken even by the mountains. She drew strength from it, though she said nothing. That night, after they ate stew made from the hares, Daniel sat by the fire, whittling a piece of pine into something small. Clara watched him, the baby kicking faintly against her ribs, her curiosity finally breaking through her reserve. "What are you carving?" she asked softly. He glanced up. "Horse," he said. "Used to make them for—" His voice trailed and he went quiet. Clara didn't press, but she knew. He had lost something once, something that had carved the silence deep into his bones. She leaned back, her hands folded over her stomach, and whispered, "Maybe you'll show my baby how to make one someday." Daniel's knife slowed. For the first time in years, the thought of tomorrow didn't feel like a burden. He didn't answer, but he didn't dismiss it either. As the fire burned low, Clara drifted into restless sleep, her dreams heavy with shadows of Matthew, the man who had abandoned her. She saw him riding away, his face cold, his words sharp. "You'll figure it out, Clara. You always do." She woke with a start, tears wetting her cheeks, her breath shallow. The baby kicked harder than before, a reminder that her time was running short. Daniel was already awake, sitting by the window with his rifle across his knees. He didn't turn when she stirred, but his voice came low. "Riders on the ridge." Clara's blood ran cold. "Riders." Daniel nodded. 2, maybe 3, moving slow, but they're watching. Clara's heart pounded, dread settling in her stomach. "Do you think?" "I think men don't ride this far up the mountain without reason," Daniel said, his eyes never leaving the ridge. He rose, checking the rifle, his movements calm but sharp with readiness. "Storm S over, which means trouble S found its way back." Clara clutched the blanket tighter, her breath shaking. She knew then that her fight for survival wasn't over, not for herself, not for her child. And as Daniel Holt stood watch at the window, his silhouette framed by the dim light of dawn, she realized he wasn't just a mountain man living alone. He was a shield, whether he wanted to be or not. The knock that had saved her life had also tied her fate to his. And now, with riders circling the ridge, that bond was about to be tested in ways neither of them could yet imagine. The valley lay quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that pressed down like a weight, heavy and wrong. Daniel Holt stood by the window, his rifle in hand, eyes fixed on the ridge above the pines. 2 riders had lingered there at first light, their silhouettes sharp against the snow. They hadn't moved fast, hadn't charged down, but they hadn't turned away either. Men who loitered in the high country weren't lost. They were waiting, watching. Inside, Clara Martin pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, her fingers digging into the wool. Her stomach twisted, not just from the child within but from the dread curling through her veins. She sat by the hearth, the fire low but steady, and tried to quiet her breathing. Each kick from the baby reminded her that fear wasn't a luxury she could afford. Still, her voice trembled when she spoke. "Do you think they know we're here?" Daniel didn't glance back. His eyes stayed on the tree line, his jaw set like stone. Men like that don't come this far unless they're sure of something. Maybe they saw smoke. Maybe they just got curious. Either way, they'll find reason enough to look closer. Clara's heart pounded, her thoughts spinning. If they come, she stopped, unable to finish. Daniel finally turned. His eyes, cold and steady, met hers. "If they come, we deal with it." It wasn't reassurance, not really, but something about the certainty in his tone steadied her. She nodded faintly, though her hand still shook. Hours dragged on, the sun climbing slow, the shadows stretching across the snow. Daniel worked in silence, checking his rifle, sharpening his knife, moving with the precision of a man who had lived too long expecting trouble. Clara tried to busy herself with small tasks, washing tin cups, folding the blanket, but her eyes kept drifting to the window. Each time she half expected to see men charging down the ridge. By midday, the riders were gone from sight, swallowed by the timber. That was worse than seeing them. Daniel's gut twisted at the absence. He stepped onto the porch, scanning the trees, listening. Only the creek spoke, its steady song breaking through the hush. No birds, no squirrels, just silence. The kind of silence that meant predators, the two-legged kind, were near. When he came back in, Clara was standing by the table, her hands braced against the wood to steady herself. Her face was pale, her breathing uneven. "They won't leave us alone, will they?" she asked. Daniel shook his head once. "Not if they came looking for something, and men who look don't stop until they take it." Clara lowered her eyes, her hands sliding to her belly. Her voice cracked when she whispered, "Then what if what they want is me?" The words lodged in Daniel's chest like a splinter. He had thought it too, though he hadn't spoken it aloud. Men who rode these mountains often hunted more than game. They hunted weakness. A woman alone, pregnant, starving, that was the kind of prey wolves circled for days. And if they thought Daniel Holt had something worth taking, they'd test him for it. He crossed to the table, his presence filling the room. "You're under my roof," he said, his voice quiet but edged with steel. "Which means no man touches you, not while I stand." Clara's eyes filled, tears spilling fast, but she blinked them away. She wanted to believe him, and in that moment she almost did. The way he stood, the way his voice carried, it felt like truth. Yet she knew truth alone couldn't stop bullets or blades. "Still," she whispered, "thank you." Evening settled heavy, the light dimming to a bruised purple. Daniel lit the lantern, his movements careful, deliberate. Clara sat near the fire, her head bowed, whispering prayers under her breath. Daniel heard her voice, faint but clear, asking God for protection, for strength, for mercy. Something in his chest twisted as he listened. He hadn't spoken to God in years, not since the day the earth swallowed everyone he loved. But the sound of her whispered pleas stirred memories he had buried beneath stone and snow. The knock came after dark. It wasn't loud. It was deliberate, measured, the kind of knock that didn't ask permission. Clara froze, her breath catching in her throat. Her hand flew to her belly as if to shield the child. Daniel set down his knife, his hand closing around the rifle. His voice came low, steady as bedrock. "Stay back from the door." The knock came again, harder this time. Then a voice, smooth as oil, carried through the wood. "Evening, friend. Storms passed but left us cold and hungry. Thought we'd find a neighbor willing to share the fire." Clara's eyes flew to Daniel. Her lips trembled, but she didn't speak. She didn't need to. Both of them knew these weren't neighbors. Daniel stepped closer to the door, his voice sharp. "Cabin's full, try elsewhere." A pause. Then the laugh of a man who wasn't truly asking. Now, no need to be unfriendly, we saw smoke. Knew someone had to be here, and we don't mind sharing close quarters." Clara's stomach clenched, her breath shallow. Daniel's finger brushed the rifle's trigger guard. His eyes flicked toward the shuttered window. Shadows moved outside, at least two, maybe more. The voice grew harder. "Open the door, mountain man, or we'll open it for you." Clara's hand clamped over her mouth to stifle a sob. The baby stirred within, restless as though sensing the danger pressing against the walls. Daniel's mind raced. He had fought off wolves, outlasted storms, but men at his door meant something else entirely. Men didn't knock to ask. They knocked to take. He turned to Clara, his eyes locking with hers. "Get low, stay quiet. No matter what happens, you don't move." Her lips parted as if to protest, but the weight in his gaze silenced her. She nodded, sinking down beside the hearth, pulling the blanket around herself and her unborn child. The third knock thundered, rattling the door in its frame. This time it wasn't a request, it was a warning. Daniel Holt raised his rifle, his shoulders squaring, his jaw tightening like iron. He had lived alone for years, but tonight his cabin held more than just his own life. Tonight, everything had changed. And as the door shuddered beneath the fists of the men outside, he knew one thing clear as the firelight: he would not let them through. The fourth knock didn't come as a knock at all. It was a boot, hard and sudden, that struck against the door and shook the hinges. The sound thundered through the cabin like a gunshot, and Clara flinched where she crouched near the hearth, clutching her belly with both hands. The baby shifted again inside her, restless as though the fear in her chest had passed straight through into the child's tiny bones. She pressed her lips together, whispering a prayer so faint it was almost breath alone. Daniel Holt didn't move from his stance. He stood squared before the door, rifle at the ready, his frame a wall between her and the men outside. His voice cut through the heavy silence with a steadiness that only years of solitude and loss could carve into a man. "Last warning," he said. "Step away from this cabin." Laughter carried back, rough and mocking, the kind that didn't belong to men asking permission but to wolves circling a kill. "Come now, mountain man," the voice drawled, smoother than it had any right to be. "We're just looking for warmth, maybe a bite to eat. You've got enough for 3, I reckon. No harm in sharing." Daniel's jaw tightened. He heard more boots crunching snow outside, 3 at least, maybe 4. Men who rode this far up weren't looking for stew. They'd seen Clara, or at least the faint shadow of her, and that was reason enough. The door rattled under another blow, and Daniel shifted the rifle higher, his finger brushing close to the trigger. Behind him, Clara pressed herself closer to the stone hearth, the blanket pooled around her like armor too thin to matter. She watched him, her eyes wide, and for the first time since he'd opened the door to her days ago, she realized he wasn't just a man who had chosen solitude. He was a man who had built himself into a fortress because he had to be. The voice outside hardened, stripping away the veneer of civility. "Open it, or we burn you out." Clara gasped softly, covering her mouth with both hands. Burn. She saw it in her mind, the flames, the smoke, the helplessness. Her child, choking before it had even drawn its first breath. Tears spilled hot down her cheeks, but she didn't make a sound. Daniel's eyes narrowed. He moved with sudden swiftness, sliding the heavy bar of wood across the door, locking it firm. Then he crossed to the window, peering through the narrow slit in the shutter. 3 men on horseback, their silhouettes sharp in the moonlight. One leaned forward in the saddle, a torch already in hand, its flame flickering bright against the night. Daniel's voice came low, so low Clara barely heard it. "They mean it." She wanted to speak, to ask what he would do, but her throat closed. Her whole body trembled with the weight of fear and the ache of her child pressing down. Instead, she whispered, "God help us." The first torch flew before the words had finished leaving her lips. It arced through the cold air, landing against the roof, where the thatch was still damp from melted snow. Flames sputtered but clung, licking upward, small but growing. Daniel cursed under his breath, not a profanity but the kind of wordless sound a man makes when the fight he tried to avoid has already begun. He flung the shutter wide, aimed and fired. The rifle cracked through the night, echoing off the ridges. One rider cried out, tumbling from his horse, and the animal bolted into the trees. The other two wheeled fast, their shouts tearing through the stillness, and another torch soared toward the wall. This one struck near the window, scattering embers across the logs. Clara let out a sharp cry, covering her face. Daniel reloaded with practiced speed, his movements crisp, honed by years of living in a land where hesitation killed. He fired again, the shot ripping the torch from the second man's hand before it landed. The flame tumbled harmless into the snow, hissing out in smoke. But the third rider didn't flee. He spurred his horse closer, his revolver flashing in the dark. The window shutter splintered as a bullet tore through, lodging deep into the cabin's far wall. Clara screamed, the sound raw and involuntary, her arms tightening around her stomach as if she could shield the child from lead itself. Daniel dropped low, dragging the shutter back into place. "Stay down," he barked, though Clara was already pressed flat against the floor, her breath ragged, tears blinding her. The horses thundered closer, circling, the men shouting threats and curses that filled the air. They weren't leaving, not tonight, and Clara knew with terrible clarity they weren't just after supplies, they were after her. Daniel shouldered the rifle, his face grim. He had seen this play before, desperate men, reckless with hunger and greed, trying to pry open another man's door. Only this time there was more than himself inside, more than his solitude. He turned, and for a fleeting second his eyes met Clara's. Something passed between them, not words, not promises, but a vow as sure as any spoken. Another bullet split the night, shattering a piece of the doorframe. Clara clutched the blanket, her body trembling with each kick of the child within. Fear clawed at her throat, but beneath it burned something else, fury. Fury that her baby's first breath might be stolen by men who had no claim. The firelight flickered against the walls as Daniel pulled a second rifle from the rack. He slid it across the floor to her. "If they breach, you point and pull," he said, his tone sharp, unyielding. Clara's hands shook as she stared at the weapon. "I've never." "You don't need to aim straight," Daniel cut in. "You just need to make them think twice." Her breath caught, and slowly, with trembling hands, she wrapped her fingers around the stock. The wood was heavy, cold, but it grounded her. She wasn't just a starving widow anymore. She was a mother, and mothers fought. The riders circled again, their voices loud, their torches blazing. The cabin walls shook with the pounding of hooves, the roar of threats, and Daniel Holt stood ready, his body braced, his jaw set. He had built his life to keep the world out, but tonight the world had come anyway. And as the flames danced higher on the roof, Clara Martin realized with heart-stopping certainty that her child's fate now hinged on the will of the mountain man who had opened the door when no one else would. The cabin walls seemed to breathe with every impact, the thud of hooves circling outside, the rattling strikes against the door, the crack of bullets biting into wood. Clara Martin pressed her back to the hearthstones, her belly heavy, her heart pounding so hard she feared it might burst. She held the rifle Daniel had shoved into her trembling hands, the stock slick where her palms sweated against the worn wood. Her eyes never left him, not even as sparks showered down from the roof where the torch still smoldered. Daniel Holt moved with a calm that felt otherworldly, each action measured, precise. He poured water into a bucket from the kettle and hurled it onto the ceiling beams, hissing steam filling the cabin. Then, without hesitation, he reloaded his rifle and cracked the shutter open just enough to catch sight of the shadows riding past. He fired once, and the echo rolled through the valley like thunder. A cry answered, sharp and guttural, followed by the sound of a rider tumbling into the snow. The horses screamed and stamped as the others pulled back. For a moment silence fell, tense, thin, a silence that spoke of men regrouping, not retreating. Clara dared to raise her head, her eyes wide. Did you stop them?" Daniel shook his head, never lowering his weapon. "Not yet." He moved closer to the door, his boots grinding against the floorboards. His shadow stretched long across the cabin, cast by the lantern's weak flame. Men like this don't leave empty-handed. They'll try again harder. Clara's throat tightened. She whispered a prayer into the blanket pooled around her knees, asking God to hold steady the hands of the man between her and the dark. She pressed her palm to her stomach, feeling the faint, urgent kicks within. The baby knew, somehow the child knew, that danger pressed against the walls. A voice rang out from beyond the door, loud, mocking, threaded with menace. "You're good with a gun, mountain man, I'll give you that. But every man runs out of bullets, and when you do, we'll take what's ours." Clara froze, her heart stuttering. She heard the words behind the words, "take what's ours." It wasn't food they wanted, it was her. Daniel's jaw set hard. He called back, his voice carrying steady and strong into the night. "Nothing in this cabin belongs to you. Ride on, or you'll bury more of your own before morning." Laughter answered, mean and sharp. Then the sound of hooves retreated into the trees, but Daniel didn't relax. He knew better than to think they had gone. Wolves circled, waiting for weakness, and these men were no different. He turned back toward Clara. "They'll try again before dawn." Her lips trembled, her eyes glistening. "Why us?" Daniel hesitated. He thought of the way her figure must have looked through the window, faint in the firelight, a woman alone carrying a child. Easy prey. His chest tightened, fury clawing at his ribs. He didn't tell her the full truth. He only said, "Because they think you're defenseless." Clara's breath shook as she clutched the rifle tighter. Her voice broke, but she forced the words out. "Then they'll learn they're wrong." The hours dragged, heavy with waiting. Daniel moved through the cabin like a shadow, checking the shutters, stacking buckets of water near the door, laying extra rounds on the table. Clara fought her exhaustion, her body demanding rest but her heart refusing it. She sat near the hearth, whispering prayers until her voice grew hoarse, her hand never leaving her belly. The knock came again, but this time it was no knock at all. It was an explosion. The door splintered inward under the weight of a boot and a shoulder, the bar holding but cracking. Clara screamed, clutching the rifle as splinters sprayed across the room. Daniel raised his weapon and fired through the gap, the blast deafening. A howl answered, then silence again. The bar sagged under the strain. Another blow rattled it, another, the hinges screaming in protest. Daniel grabbed the heavy table, dragging it against the door as reinforcement. His muscles strained, his teeth gritted, but he didn't falter. Clara scrambled to her knees, clutching the rifle tight, her breath fast and shallow. Then it came, the sound she had feared most, the hiss of flames catching. Smoke curled through the shutters, acrid and bitter. The men had stopped trying to break in. They meant to burn the cabin down. Clara's cry split the air. "Daniel!" He was already moving. He flung open the back shutter, the one that led toward the creek, the icy air rushing in. He turned to her, his voice hard but urgent. "Out, now." Clara froze. The snow outside was deep, the night merciless. But the smoke stung her throat and she saw the fire licking across the roof beams. She knew, if they stayed, the child would never live to see dawn. Daniel seized her arm, helping her to her feet. "Hold steady. Don't let go of the rifle." They stumbled into the night, the snow swallowing their steps. The cold hit Clara like knives, stealing her breath, but Daniel's arm was iron at her side, pulling her forward. Behind them, the cabin glowed orange, smoke billowing upward as the men shouted, triumphant. But their triumph was short. Daniel led Clara not toward the open trail but into the dark timber, where the creek cut a narrow path. He pushed her down into the hollow, the icy water biting at their boots, the noise of the current masking their movements. Clara gasped at the shock, clutching her belly as pain lanced sharp through her. She bit down hard on her lip to keep from crying out. Above them, voices echoed. "They're gone, find them." Torches swayed, shadows shifting between the trees. The men spread out, their shouts growing louder. Daniel pressed Clara against the bank, his body shielding hers. He leaned close, his breath hot against her ear. Not a sound. Her tears spilled silently, freezing against her cheeks. She held the rifle tight across her lap, her other hand pressed firm against her stomach. whispering only in her mind, "Please, Lord, let us live through this night." The torches drew closer, the glow sliding across the snow, the men cursing, calling. Horses snorted, hooves breaking branches. Clara's whole body trembled, not just from cold but from the fear that any second the light would fall on them, that any second a hand would tear her from the bank and drag her child into the firelit dark. Daniel's muscles were taut, his finger resting against the trigger of his rifle, ready to cut down the first man who stepped too near. His heartbeat thundered steady, not from fear but from the resolve that had kept him alive all these years. He had thought he had nothing left to lose. Tonight had proven him wrong. For an eternity the voices circled, then drifted away, fading back toward the burning cabin. Clara let out a shuddering breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, but Daniel didn't move. He waited, silent as stone, until the forest swallowed every last echo. Only then did he ease her forward, guiding her deeper along the creek. Smoke rose behind them, black against the stars. His home was gone, his years of solitude burned to ash in a single night. But he didn't look back, not once. Clara stumbled against him, her strength failing. I ca, her voice broke, her body sagging, one hand clutched against her stomach as a sharp cry tore from her lips. Daniel caught her before she collapsed fully into the snow. His eyes widened as realization struck. This wasn't just exhaustion. This was labor. Her face twisted in pain, her breath ragged. "It's time," she gasped, tears spilling fast. "The baby, it's coming now." Daniel's blood ran cold, his heart pounding. The men were still out there, the night still thick with danger, and now, in the heart of the wilderness, Clara Martin was about to bring life into the world. He gathered her into his arms, his voice steady though his chest roared with urgency. "Then we move fast. Hold on, Clara. Hold on for both of you." The creek carved deeper into the trees, the snow falling quiet, the firelight fading behind. Ahead lay only darkness, and in that darkness, a birth neither of them were ready for but both knew was unavoidable. The forest swallowed them whole. Snow muffled every step, branches clawed at their shoulders, and the creek beside them hissed like a serpent winding its way through the valley. Daniel Holt carried Clara in his arms, his jaw set, his breath hard and sharp in the freezing night. Smoke still rose behind them where his cabin burned, and the voices of the riders carried faint and scattered, searching in the wrong places. For now, he knew it would not last. Clara clung to him, her face pressed against his chest, her arms limp but her hands curled tight into his coat. Each contraction seized her body like a storm, sharp and merciless. She bit her lip to keep from crying out, but a broken whimper escaped her throat all the same. Her belly tightened beneath his arm, heavy and urgent, and he felt her whole body shudder with the weight of labor. "Not here," Daniel muttered under his breath, though the words were more for himself than her. "Not in the open." He knew these woods as well as his own hands, every hollow, every ridge. He veered off the creek's edge, climbing a short rise where pines leaned heavy together. The air smelled of sap, thick and sharp, and above them the stars burned cold. He found a shallow cave tucked into the hillside, barely wide enough to crawl into, but it was shelter from the wind, and tonight's shelter was all that mattered. He laid her down on the packed earth floor, rolling his coat beneath her head. The firelight glow from the burning cabin painted the distant horizon, but here in the cave there was only darkness, the faint shimmer of starlight filtering through the entrance. Daniel struck flint fast, his hands practiced, until a small flame licked at a bundle of dry moss. He fed it with twigs until the glow grew steady, then laid the fire low so it wouldn't betray their hiding place. Clara shifted, her hands gripping her swollen belly, her breath ragged. "Daniel," she gasped, her voice breaking on his name. "It's happening. I can't stop it." He crouched beside her, his hand steadying her shoulder. "You don't stop it," he said quietly, though his throat was tight. "You breathe through it, you fight through it. You hear me." Her eyes found his in the dim firelight, wide and wet with fear. She nodded faintly, tears spilling down her cheeks. Another contraction seized her and she cried out, her body arching against the cold ground. Daniel pressed his palm against hers, letting her squeeze until her knuckles whitened. He had not been beside a woman in birth since before the mountains had claimed his life, but instinct and sheer will surge through him now. He could not afford doubt. Not tonight. The hours bled together, marked only by the fire's crackle and Clara's cries. She labored long, her strength faltering, her face slick with sweat despite the cold. Daniel wiped her brow with the edge of his shirt, murmuring quiet words that felt strange on his tongue after so many years of silence. "Breathe, Clara. You're stronger than this storm, stronger than them." At one point she sobbed, her voice ragged. "I can't, Daniel, I can't do it." His hand tightened around hers, his eyes burning with fierce resolve. "Yes, you can. You didn't walk all this way, you didn't survive every mile just to quit now. That child is coming, Clara, and you're going to meet it." Her breath hitched, her cry breaking into a laugh, half sob, half belief. She bore down again, her whole body straining, and Daniel steadied her through it, his broad frame bent low, his hands sure and careful. At last, as dawn's first pale light bled into the sky outside the cave, the cry of a newborn split the silence. Thin, hoarse, but alive, fiercely alive. Clara collapsed back, tears streaming, her chest heaving, as Daniel lifted the tiny child into his arms. The baby was small, red-faced, fists clenched against the world, its cry breaking again and again into the cold morning air. For a long moment Daniel just stared, the weight of the infant strange and shattering in his hands. He had thought his days of holding life so new and fragile were long gone, stolen from him years before. Yet here it was, squirming and warm, breathing. Alive. He looked back to Clara, her eyes wide with awe and exhaustion, her lips trembling with joy. "It's a girl," Daniel said softly, his voice rough. Clara let out a sob, reaching weakly for the child. Daniel placed the baby in her arms, watching as her trembling hands pulled the infant close against her chest. Clara kissed the damp crown of her daughter's head, whispering over and over, "Thank you, Lord, thank you." Her tears fell freely, soaking the blanket Daniel had wrapped around the newborn. He sat back on his heels, his own chest tight. He had not prayed in years, had not spoken to God since the day he buried his family beneath hard earth and cold stone. But hearing Clara's voice, seeing the miracle of a child born into the wilderness, and yet breathing strong, it stirred something he thought had died inside him. The baby's cries softened as she nestled against her mother's breast. Clara looked up at Daniel, her eyes shining despite the exhaustion that weighed her down. "She's alive," she whispered, as though still trying to believe it. "She's alive," Daniel echoed, his gaze lingering on the tiny fist that reached skyward, clumsy but determined. For a moment the world felt still, untouched by the men who hunted them, untouched by the flames that had devoured his home. In that cave, there was only the sound of new life, fragile yet undeniable. But the peace did not hold. Hooves thundered faint in the distance, shouts carrying across the ridges. The men hadn't given up. They were still searching, their anger no less for the hours lost. Daniel's head snapped toward the sound, his instincts snapping back into place. His home was gone. His fire was gone, but the fight was not. Clara clutched her daughter closer, fear flooding her veins anew. "They'll find us," she whispered, panic rising. Daniel gripped his rifle, his shoulders squaring. His voice came low, steady as stone. "Not if I find them first." He looked at the woman lying in the dirt, at the newborn pressed tight to her chest. He thought of how easily he could have left her in the storm, how simple it would have been to close the door that night. And then he thought of what had happened instead. For the first time in years, Daniel Holt had something to lose again. And for that he knew he would fight like the devil himself had come knocking. The cries of the newborn faded into soft murmurs, her tiny chest rising and falling as she slept against her mother's breast. Clara Martin lay half reclined in the shallow cave, her body weak but her spirit fierce, every nerve still alive with the terror of what they had endured and the miracle of what had just come. Her eyes never left her child. She traced trembling fingers along the infant's cheek, whispering prayers of gratitude through her tears. She had thought she would die in the snow. She had thought her baby would never know breath. And yet here she was, wrapped in the warmth of her mother's arms, alive against all odds. Daniel Holt crouched at the mouth of the cave, his rifle steady, his eyes scanning the timberline as the sun bled pale light across the ridges. The forest was quiet but not at peace. He could feel the weight of men still out there, their anger simmering, their hunger sharpened into something more dangerous than desperation. He had seen their kind before, men who believed the wilderness owed them something, who took with violence what they could never build with their own hands. The distant thud of hooves confirmed what he already knew. They were regrouping, and they wouldn't stop until they thought themselves satisfied. Daniel's chest tightened, not with fear but with the steel of resolve. He had nothing left to defend once, nothing but himself, and that had been reason enough to keep breathing. But now, crouched in the cold earth beside a woman who had nearly perished on his doorstep and a child who had barely begun her life, he knew this was different. Behind him, Clara stirred, her voice hoarse but steady. "You can't take them all, Daniel." He turned his head just enough to meet her gaze. Her eyes were bloodshot from hours of pain, her face pale as parchment, but the fire within them had not dimmed. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he adjusted the rifle strap across his shoulder, his jaw set. Finally, his voice came, low and certain. "I don't need to take them all. I just need to make them wish they'd never come here." Clara clutched her child tighter, her lip trembling. "If something happens to you." He cut her off gently but firmly. "Nothing's going to happen to me, not while you've got her to hold." His eyes lingered on the baby, small and fragile, yet so loud in her presence it filled the cave with something Daniel hadn't felt in years: purpose. Clara's tears spilled again, but this time they weren't only born of fear. She nodded, unable to speak, and pressed her lips to her daughter's forehead. Daniel stepped out into the snow, the cold biting sharp at his skin, but his body moved like a man possessed. He had lived alone in these mountains for years, his senses sharpened, his instincts honed. Now every ounce of that life would be tested. He moved low along the creek, weaving through the timber until he caught sight of the riders below. 4 of them remained, torches sputtering as they scanned the valley, their curses carrying on the wind. Daniel's eyes narrowed. He counted their weapons, their horses, the way they carried themselves. These weren't starving men anymore. They were predators furious at having been denied their prey. His grip tightened on the rifle. For a moment he thought of all he had lost before, of the family buried in the earth, of the nights when silence had been his only companion. And then he thought of Clara's voice breaking in the storm, of the newborn's cry shattering the dark. He breathed once, steady and deep, and pulled the trigger. The crack of the rifle split the valley, echoing off the ridges. One rider tumbled backward, his torch extinguished in the snow. The others scrambled, shouts rising as they sought cover. Daniel reloaded, his movements swift, honed by years of practice. Another shot rang out, grazing the shoulder of a second man, spinning him from the saddle. The remaining 2 fired blindly into the trees, their bullets snapping branches, their shouts growing wilder. But Daniel moved like the forest itself, silent, relentless, always where they didn't expect. He fired again, and another horse screamed, throwing its rider into the snow. The last man, the one with the smooth voice that had knocked so confidently at Daniel's door, turned his horse in panic. "You're a dead man, Holt," he bellowed, but his voice cracked with fear. He wheeled his mount and fled down the ridge, his torch a streak of orange vanishing into the dark. Daniel held his rifle steady, tracking the man until he was swallowed by the trees. He lowered the weapon only when silence returned, broken only by the groans of the wounded crawling across the snow. He didn't finish them. He didn't need to. The mountains would. When he returned to the cave, Clara's eyes searched his face with desperate urgency. "Daniel." He knelt beside her, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder. "It's done." Her breath shuddered, relief washing over her like a flood. She clutched her daughter tighter, sobbing softly into the child's hair. Daniel fed the fire higher, its glow warming the cave, and for the first time since the night the knock had come, the weight pressing down on them eased. Hours passed, the day stretching thin and cold. Daniel watched the ridges for movement, but none came. Clara slept fitfully, her child nestled close, and in the rare quiet Daniel found his eyes lingering on them. He saw not just a woman who had stumbled into his solitude, but a mother who had fought tooth and nail to bring life into a world determined to steal it. He saw a child who had been born into fire and blood, yet breath steady in her mother's arms. He felt something stir deep inside, something he had thought buried forever: hope. By the time dusk fell again, the fire burned strong in the cave, casting its glow over them all. Clara woke, her daughter still nestled close, and her eyes met Daniel's across the flames. For a long moment neither spoke. Then her voice came, soft but certain. "You didn't have to save us, but you did." Daniel looked into the fire, his face lined with shadows. "Maybe I didn't save you," he said quietly. "Maybe you saved me." Clara's lips trembled, and she lowered her gaze to the child in her arms. Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they weren't born of fear or grief. They were born of something new, something fragile but strong enough to endure. Outside, the mountains stood silent, ancient witnesses to the lives being reshaped in their shadow. And inside the cave, by the light of the fire, a mountain man who had sworn himself to solitude, and a woman who had thought herself abandoned forever began to understand that what bound them now was more than survival. It was the beginning of a family. The fire in the cave burned low, throwing shadows that seemed to sway like ghosts against the walls. Clara Martin rocked her newborn gently, her voice a soft hum of prayer and lullaby, each word fragile yet steady, woven from the remnants of strength she did not know she still had. The child stirred, whimpered, then settled again against her breast, tiny fists opening and closing as though reaching for the world she had been thrust into. Daniel Holt sat at the cave's mouth, his rifle balanced across his knees, his eyes scanning the tree line, though he knew the danger had passed for now. The riders who had threatened them were scattered, dead, wounded, or fled into the wilderness. The mountain had claimed its toll, yet his shoulders did not ease. Years of solitude had trained him to expect storms after calm, wolves after silence. Still, the weight that pressed against him now was not only vigilance. It was responsibility. For Clara. For her child. For the fragile thread of life that had been tied into his own when she knocked on his door. He glanced back at her. The firelight softened the exhaustion on her face, highlighting the fierce pride that glowed even through her weariness. She looked down at her daughter as though the world itself had been placed in her arms. Daniel's chest tightened at the sight. He had thought the mountains had buried every part of him that remembered what family felt like. But here, in this hollow of earth and stone, he felt it stir again. The night stretched on, the fire slowly dying to embers. Clara drifted into sleep at last, her child nestled against her. Daniel kept his vigil, listening to the rhythm of their breathing, the creak outside, the faint whisper of wind in the pines. He thought of the cabin, of the years he had spent alone, of the ashes now cooling on the ridge. And then he thought of what had been given in return. A new life, fragile yet fierce, and the bond that had begun between himself and the woman who carried it. When dawn broke, pale and cold, Daniel rose and stepped out into the snow. The world stretched wide and silent, the ridges glowing with light. He closed his eyes briefly, drawing in the cold air, and felt something he hadn't in years: purpose. He returned to the cave where Clara stirred awake, her daughter blinking up at the new day. Daniel crouched low, his voice steady as he spoke. "We can't stay here. The cave won't hold against another storm, but down valley there's shelter, food, a place safer than this." Clara's hand tightened protectively around her child. Fear flickered in her eyes, but beneath it was trust. She nodded slowly. "Lead the way, Daniel." He extended his hand, helping her rise. She leaned against him, her body still weak, but her spirit unbroken. The child whimpered once, then quieted as the three of them stepped into the dawn together. The snow crunched underfoot, the air sharp and clean, and behind them the smoke of the burned cabin was nothing more than a shadow against the sky. Ahead lay uncertainty, hardship, and danger still. But for the first time in years, Daniel Holt did not face it alone. And as Clara Martin carried her child into the wilderness with the mountain man at her side, she understood with bone-deep certainty that what had begun with desperation at his door had become something more. Not just survival, not just protection. The fragile beginnings of a family bound by fire, storm, and grace.